Okay, so 6.3. Everybody stop and get to 6.3. So again, Mendel's research showed, here's your key concept, showed that traits are inherited as discrete units. And we call those units genes. He didn't coin that word. I actually looked it up the other day. And you can read, there's like 2 or 3 scientists that kind of at times will get credit for coming up with the gene word. It came from Darwin used pangenesis, and then the pan was dropped and from genesis down to gene. Somebody else used pangenic or something. Anyway, doesn't matter. But he was talking about what we now call genes. Okay. Now Mendel. So not bold. So stay with me. So just some background information on Mendel here. He was an Austrian monk. And now it's the Czech Republic is where he lived, so a different country now. And he studied these patterns of inheritance while he was a gardener. Okay, now you have to think back that a gardener in the 1800s is not like a hobby, right? Think about that. A gardener's important. Since he was a monk and he lived in a monastery and his job was gardening, he was providing what for all his colleagues? Food. So this was really important. And so he was learning about, what he was doing. And while he was, trying to get the peas or the corn or whatever he was growing, he was paying attention to making seeds and of higher quality for food. So he was basically selectively breeding. But he got up on this tangent of studying the inheritance pattern. And he is well known for his research because he did an incredible job with it. His scientific method was perfect. And he figured all this stuff out in a very controlled scientific manner that he still gets praised for today. At the time, scientists and people figured that offspring were just a blending of their parents. And that's somewhat true. I'll explain a little bit more. But it's not always a blending. You might just get one trait from one parent and not another trait from a different parent. So here's his 3 decisions that made his experiments so good. Okay, so this is what we're going to write down. 1, he used purebred plants to start his experiments. He ended up doing his studies with peas, and we'll look at all the different characteristics that he tracked in these peas. He came up with some really controlled ways to cross the pollen to the eggs so that, he knew exactly what plant had bred with what plant. So he controlled the breeding. Then he tracked 7 different traits. And the traits didn't have any variation besides they were either this way or they were that way. So, for example, the flowers on peas were either purple or they were white. There wasn't like a pinkish or anything in between. And so only tracking 2 traits that were just either or traits made it way more simpler. So here's a picture of the peas that we're pretty familiar with nowadays. And you can see some of the morphology, some of the structures or the anatomy here. Here's the pod, and inside the pod you see the peas, and I'll show you the traits in a second, but here we have green pod color, green seed color. Eyes up here, you guys. The peas are smooth. The pod is smooth. So these were traits he was looking at. Can I go? Now over on the left, I want you guys to get his 7 characteristics or traits that he was tracking. Pea shape, pea color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and the height. So jot those down quickly. Okay, real quick, look at the dominant trait. And how do we know it's dominant? Well, look at the numbers. 5,474 round versus wrinkled peas. This one I think is the most interesting. I would have thought their color that was dominant would be what? Well, that's all we see. But we've obviously bred them. We must like green peas better than yellow peas. I don't know if there's a difference in taste or not. I don't know what the deal is. Right? But I've never seen a yellow pea. But in the wild, yeah, pretty much. I mean, when peas, before we started really breeding them, which we've probably been breeding peas for thousands of years, but the seeds that he was using, yellow was definitely dominant. Okay? Flower color, it's purple versus white. Smooth versus constricted. Like this reminds me of snow peas. You know how the pod's constricted so you could see the peas inside of it? Green pod color versus yellow. This one you might not be familiar with. Axial just means the flowers come off the stems versus like a red rose, long stem rose, only at the end. And axial is dominant. And then tall or short, no medium. And they've often called them dwarf. They're the dwarf version of peas. I guess if you needed your garden not to grow too tall, you'd appreciate the dwarf ones better than the tall ones. Okay, so under the pea, I want you guys to know the pea generation is referring to what? The parent. So get that down by your pea. And his first crosses were to take his purebred purples and breed them to his purebred white. Remember I said he was very controlled. You had to be careful because pollen can spread easily. So what he actually did is he would cut away the anther, the end of the stamen, this is the male part, that yellow is pollen. He would cut that away, making sure that it would not self-fertilize itself and discard them. If he wanted to, if he needed to collect that pollen, he'd use a paintbrush, and then he would paint the pollen pieces onto the stigma, which is the female part. So this is a pea flower model. So these are the male parts, and they even have it cross. This is the structure that makes the pollen. They're called stamens. These is the ovary. So true flowers have female and male parts. This is a true flower, this particular type of plant. And anyway, so now he paints the pollen on here, and it'll go down the tube, very much like, sperm going, through the uterus up the fallopian tube to where the eggs are waiting. And there's a bunch of eggs down here. Okay? This thing then, once the eggs are fertilized, the leaves will fall off, and this body right here will develop into a pod while those eggs develop into the peas within the pod. Okay? So all flowers, normal flowers, unless we've made them so they're not fertile anymore through breeding, will grow into some sort of fruit. Even roses, if you guys ever saw the rose bushes at the end of the season, they have rose hibs on them. And that is a little fruit. Okay, question? They actually use it, there's vitamin C and they make vitamins out of it. It's not a yummy fruit. There's just, it's packed with seeds. I've cut one apart for fun to check it out. But there is a little bit of fleshy tissue. It's hard and leathery, which I guess is high in vitamin C because they use it for that. But a lot of plants also have poisons. Some plants don't want to be eaten. Some plants want to be eaten, so they make yummy fruit, so their seeds can be spread, right? Some of those seeds need to go through a whole digestive tract to break down parts of it so that when they're pooped out, they're ready to germinate. So there's this coevolution going with seeds and who possibly eats them, or some plants are like, no, don't be eating my seeds. I'll make poisons and kill you. Okay? So, now, first generation. Put this all down under the F1. This F does not stand for first. The number 1 stands for first. The F is like fidel, which has to do with having offspring. Like even the word from F from fatherly. You don't need to remember that. So what happened? He bred the purple flowered peas to the white flowered peas, and all the babies were what color? Purple. The white trait disappeared. And this is called, in this case, heterozygous, and I'll explain that more later. Then he took these purple babies, the F1 generation, and he crossed them to make what? The F2, the second generation. And guess what? Some plants, most of them, had purple flowers, but some had white. And here are the ratios of those crosses. So first get your bolds down, and then I'll explain. Okay, here I go, people. Eyes up here. Wait, stay with me. So, purebred purple, hello, crossed with purebred white. All the babies were purple, okay? Bred these babies to make the F2 generation, and this ratio is supported by those numbers that I showed you on that other chart, okay? You basically get 3 purples to every 1 white, or 75% purple. What percent? 25. We can do a little math. Okay, from all those experimenting, took about 8 to 10 years. This is what he concludes. That's this this is conclusions. Leave the result box empty, please. Record. Okay, people. So, Mendel figured out that traits are obviously inherited from their parents. Okay? He wasn't the only one to do this. He was just doing it really well with all his scientific designs and all his data supporting it. But he also came up with a law. A law always happens. And this is the case with these types of genes. So, organisms inherit 2 copies of each gene. They get information from each parent. That is 100% true. So it's a law. And we know that already. And then the second part is the 2 copies segregate during gamete formation. So remember when we were doing our meiosis modeling? And actually not at that point. When you separate from your homologs, right? It was random. So what direction you went, one way or the other. And then you split again. So that's all we're talking about. They segregate during gamete formation, right? I've been saying this over and over. One of the chromosomes that came from your dad will be in one of your eggs or sperm, or the one from your mom. That's what it means. Segregate just means to separate. Oh. Okay, so 6.4, you guys, this will go very quick because you should have everything down. But I need to explain it to you first. Genes, recall these little pieces of DNA that you inherit, encode for proteins. The proteins that they make or that they code for gives us our difference. For example, pigments in hair, they're proteins. My protein is different than somebody else's protein. So there's variation there. Okay, so you know what a gene is. I've been saying it for a while. You guys know what homologous chromosomes are. And genes are found at specific locations on the specific chromosomes. So when we draw the little picture here, here's a chromosome from dad, here's a chromosome from mom. There is information right here. These are the genes. Okay? And those genes say be wrinkled. We're talking about peas. Now, another little vocab word here, genome. All the organism's genetic material is called your genome. So the Human Genome Project was when they decoded all of the human chromosomes. Okay? At first, they just did it for one individual. Okay? But since then, they've probably done it for 100. Just then to see variation for the whole genome. But now they just target certain areas to see the differentiation between humans, or anything for that matter. Okay, so genotype, very important. You're listening to me, we're going to use this vocab word a lot. The genotype is telling you the genetic makeup of the genes. So this is where those symbols come from. So if it's big R, it's called homozygous dominant. The capital tells you that it's dominant. You guys are looking around. Pay attention to me. Okay? Heterozygous, the letters are different. You guys see that? One's capital, one's lowercase. Okay? Yes, they're the same thing as an R, but they're different. They symbolize different things. So it's called heterozygous. Little r is called what? Homozygous. They're the same, but they are recessive, and I know that because they're the lowercase. Okay? Now, look at the pea pod. It's been dried out. For the peas to be mature enough to be dormant, so that they can wake up later and start growing, the peas dry out. Okay? So, look. We have figured out the genotypes. Yes. Do you see how this is a round seed versus a wrinkled seed? Do you guys see how that we use the letter R to represent it because round is dominant? Okay, we're not going to use W's. Okay? So if it is wrinkled, it has to be recessive. It has to be homozygous like this. But check this out. If it's round, we don't know if it's big R or big R, little r, because the R is dominant. Okay? All right, and then you guys wrote down allele. Now this one's, sometimes I'll say allele, sometimes I'll say gene. I'll try and work on it. But allele is then talking about the different possibilities. Wrinkled or round. The allele is not the whole gene, it's only one. So it's the big R or the little r. That's the allele. It's not that big of a deal. So each parent denotes one allele for every gene. And I talked to you about these symbols. Okay, and then dominant, I've talked about. Recessive, right? This guy's got this. So how many genotypes can there be for a dominant phenotype or a dominant characteristic? How many genotypes are possible for a dominant trait? 2, because you could have homodominant or you could have hetero. Do you guys see this? You could also say this one, this carries information to be wrinkled, but it doesn't matter because this overpowers it. It's dominant. Okay, so recessive, the only way we're going to get a recessive phenotype or trait or characteristic like wrinkled is, what's the genotype have to be? Homozygous recessive. You can only have one genotype for this possible trait. Okay, there they are. Then phenotype. So I told you better remember what genotype is. Genotype is the 2 alleles together making up a gene. I memorized this with the genotype, genetics, genes. We're going to use the letters to symbolize them. Phenotype, pH, like physical characteristic. This case your book says physical expression. Basically, what does it look like? You guys with me on that? So phenotype is what you're going to see. Now, so what is it? This is what? So it's round. Round. Whoops. Okay? So you don't know if it's this or this. Okay, so that's phenotype.